Now, last Friday in a court filing, the attorneys for the ACC hinted toward possibly negotiating a buyout for Florida State when it comes to their media rights and conference affiliation with said ACC. Now, in this college football world, we know this is a complex issue, right? And let's be honest, sometimes it's worth paying more to get out of a bad marriage. You don't even have to pay child support in this one, right? It's just straight alimony. Let's wipe our hands and get done. Now, it's obvious that Florida State and a couple other schools have worked harder than a single mother in trying to keep the ACC somewhere in the ballpark of the SEC and the Big Ten. Now, it hasn't worked, but they have done more than their fair share, and they're sick of doing it. Now, not only that, but they've had to endure being looked down upon even when they're perfect. Not only are they making a lot less money than their counterparts in those two other mega conferences, but we all know there's no way in hell that an undefeated Big Ten or an SEC team was going to get left out of the 4-team playoff after going undefeated, regardless of the quarterback circumstances. So if I was Florida State, I would be trying to jump ship as well. Less money and no clout is a bad way to go through high-end athletics. But the question here isn't should they go. We all know they should. But can they? Now, their future earnings in either one of those two power conferences would eventually dwarf what they would have to pay to leave the ACC, even if it's a little bit on the high side. And we're about to get in the nitty-gritty of it. And it's a smart long-term play. Now, after the suits over at the ACC, like I said, seemingly cracked the door, like our good friend Andy Staples said, saying it's a commercial possibility for Florida State to leave, not a penalty. Florida State should bust right through that cracked door with a checkbook in one hand and a smile on their face. David, here's where I want to go with that. The ACC, I think, is dead. I think they're legitimately dead. And here's why I say that. Right now, you have the case going. It's a battle between the ACC and Florida State. The ACC wants the case played out in the state of North Carolina, which filed the lawsuit first, right, against Florida State. The ACC is headquartered in North Carolina. Florida State, who filed a lawsuit against the ACC, wants it done in the state of Florida, right? So they could both go on parallel tracks. But here's the problem. If this thing goes to trial, it could go really bad for either side. One, the ACC wants Florida State to pay like $500 million to get out of the conference. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think a court would make Florida State pay $500 million. So if the ACC does take it to court and they lose, Florida State may just walk without having to pay anything, which is a worst case scenario. Now, on the other hand, right, if Florida State somehow, there's some fallout where the court says, no, you've got to stick to the grant of rights through the full term, which is 2036, then you're stuck. Like you're in trouble, or you do somehow have to pay this vast amount of money. So it seems to me like they at some point are going to settle. There will be a settlement. Now, what will that settlement number be? My guess would be in the ballpark from people I've talked to in between $275 million to $350 million, right? Which is a little bit still on the high side if you're Florida State. But at the end of the day, if you're going to make $40, $50 million more per year in the SEC or the Big Ten, wherever you wind up, you're going to end up profiting off that in the long term. So yeah, you may have to throw a chunk of change, maybe a little bit more than what you want, but it's the smart long-term play. But having said all that, either way, if Florida State is allowed to leave, well, here comes Clemson.
Oh, yeah.
Here comes North Carolina. Here comes Virginia Tech. Here comes Virginia. And the ACC is going by the way of the Pac-12. So it seems like the Pac-12, which is now the Pac-2, and I know we're going to get into that, they were like the start of the Final Destination movie, right? They were the ones who saw the crash. Now everybody else that was involved on the trip is getting knocked out outside of the Big Ten and the SEC. So, I feel like we are heading towards the death of at least the ACC being in that next tier. Have fun with Cal and Stanford and Boston College. Maybe y'all can go see who reads the best.
Well, I feel like many across the country do. I hate to see this. I hate to see these conferences that have existed for a long time go by the wayside, mostly because I feel like the regional appeal to college athletics is going to be under attack as we see that more and more. Now, when it comes to, and it makes sense from Florida State's perspective to look at all the lost revenue they're seeing when they get to watch Vanderbilt and Northwestern in the SEC and the Big Ten.
But even worse, Florida, your rival.
Yeah, well, that makes a little more sense. I mean, that's a hardcore blue blood college football program, but even some programs that you're looking around scratching your head, like how are we going to be $30 million in the hole compared to some of these programs? I understand it from the Florida State perspective. When it comes to the specificity of this case, the ACC came out and basically said, their attorney said, if Florida State wishes to regain control of those grant of rights before the end of the term, it could attempt to repurchase them. But having to buy back a right which was assigned is not a penalty. It's simply a commercial possibility. Paying a fair price for the rights that were previously transferred cannot be a penalty under any reasonable definition of the term. The ACC is correct here. It's not a penalty. The Florida State, you signed this deal. And if I'm the ACC, I'm shocked to see language in here that would even open the door for the possibility of buying their way out of this.
That's what shocked me the most,
because you need Florida State in the conference more than you need $300 million. Yeah. What are you going to do with $300 million other than the entire conference, like you said, is going to collapse? With Florida State in there and showing Clemson and Miami, North Carolina, Virginia Tech, no, there's no way out of this for any of y'all. You signed a deal. This is the deal we're going to honor until 2036. That would at least give you another 12 years to try and figure out a solution or to gain more value so that the next TV deal could be worth more money.
Well, and we want to know what you think in the comments. We're taking live calls. This is something, obviously, that's a huge deal because it doesn't just affect football. We have to remember, we look at this through a football lens, but look at basketball. If Florida State and North Carolina were to leave, what that would do to the ACC conference. Blaine, if you set the precedent, let's just put a number on it. Let's say Florida State and the ACC, they don't want to end up seeing it play out in trial. They want to settle. You pay this alimony, and we'll shake hands and be done, and it's $300 million. Well, now precedent is set. So North Carolina pays $300 million, right? Let's say the ACC ends up with like 1.2 or even $1.5 billion. That's great. You made all this money, but all you're going to do is just linger and hang around and have that extra money to what? Try and just sustain yourself? Like to be able to just pay the bills for a couple extra years? I don't look down the road and see, if Florida State leaves, the ACC is done. They're done. There's no coming back. And when I say done, I don't mean that they're going to fold and end up being only two like the Pac-12, right? They've added SMU, and they've added Cal, and they've added Stanford. But as far as being in that next tier, or being close, or being able to compete in basketball, or compete in baseball at a high level, you're cooked.
No, it's over with. There's no coming back. In my eyes, the ACC is already done as a conference. I mean, they are. At some point, it's just going to be the Big 12 and the SEC. I mean, the Big 10 and the SEC. That's what it's going to be. It's going to be Fox versus ESPN. That's the place we're going. If I'm a team in the ACC, why would I ever want to be in there? What good thing is me being in the ACC? It's not I'd get out as quick as possible, if I could anyways.
Well, I'll say this about the Big 12. I think the Big 12 has staying power. I think what Brett Yormark did was very smart. He's going to kind of basically put themselves and fill the void or the vacuum of the Pac-12 and the ACC losing relevance. The Big 12 will be the next up. I mean, if the ACC goes, we now go from a Power 5, which we went to a Power 4 with the Pac-12. If the ACC disappears, now we're in a Power 3. And if you look at the Big 12, who's the last big dog left that says, you know what? At the end of the day, we're fine with being a power in basketball. We'll be good enough in football, but that's why, and I'll continue to go back to what I said, Brett Yormark bringing in Houston, bringing in UCF, bringing in Cincinnati, bringing in BYU was unbelievably smart because there's only so many big dogs left out there that could sustain you and you could get value from. Look at Houston in basketball, ranked. Look at BYU in basketball, ranked. Got a big one tonight, and I'm just talking about basketball. I'm not even talking about football. Look at UCF. Not a bad basketball program or athletics program overall. Cincinnati, typically really good in basketball. I still like their coach. I know they've struggled a little bit this year, but I feel like those teams have staying power. The ACC loses who they lose. Not only do they have staying power, they're going to go the way of the dodo bird eventually. It's so the math.
Two of my biggest questions here, especially when you start talking about the other sports, is, what's going to happen if football does completely spin off? College football is its own entity, which we've talked about probably needs to happen because it's one of the few sports that actually produces a profit. So if the college football playoff committee or the powers that be with college football want to spin that off and sign a lucrative television rights deal that doesn't include any other sports, and they want to have revenue sharing with the athletes, how's that going to look? I mean, do the basketball and baseball teams need to switch conferences too? That's one thing that we're still going to have to figure out. And then when it comes to these conferences, you can only add so many teams before you're the college landscape again, right?
Well, that's where we think it's going, right?
Yeah. So at what point are we going to see conferences begin to kick some programs out? If it's just going to be this cherry picking where ESPN and Fox, but SEC and the Big Ten are going to say, well, we want all of the best programs to create this entity of 35, 45, 55 teams and just spin college football off on its own, then you're going to take the likes of a Miami and a Clemson or a Utah above, say, Mississippi State or Northwestern or Maryland. When are we going to get to a point where they start kicking other programs out of their
See, that's what's going to be interesting. Why look at some of the realignment we've already had with like USC and UCLA and these teams going to the Big Ten, and then Cal and Stanford going to the ACC. Apparently, they've got no problem flying across the country to play half their conference games. It hasn't stopped them yet, but we've seen schools be in different conferences depending on sports before, even without conference realignment. I mean, we see, kind of what happened to the Big East in football, right? And we've watched, Syracuse be in this conference in that sport and this one in and another one in the other. Hell, we watched Notre Dame during COVID just adopt a conference for a year in football, yet they're full-time in basketball. So there is a precedent for it. But I just find this whole thing fascinating because there's so many moving parts that you feel like is heading towards the same destination, but just the legal battles that it takes to get there, it's going to be fascinating to watch down the stretch, regardless if you like it or you don't like it. Hello, everyone on YouTube. If you're watching this, you've been selected for a very important mission. One that if you choose to accept, could lead to awesome things for you. Hit the subscribe button to find out more.